This response is a little bit more, it's a little bit meta. It's kind of just taking a moment to talk about the way that people do theology. Right now, there's probably three major ways that people do theology in contemporary contexts. There's systematic theology, which is it's more old school. It really is derived, I think, from Aquinas, and then the kind of Protestant Reformation, like the way John Calvin did things. And it's very systematic. It's like, we're going to talk about God, now we're going to talk about Christ. It's in a way, it's a little bit Fuller's curriculum's really kind of trying to incorporate newer ways, but is based ultimately on that old style of doing things. Here's your topic, let's talk about it. A newer iteration that's drawn from that is called Analytic theology. And so if you do theology here at Fuller and you do it with Oliver Crisp, for example, Oliver is an analytic theologian, and he applies the methods of analytic philosophy, which is a really rigorous use of logic to identify ideas and to tease out their logical implications. And so this is a great week to talk about that, because when we talk about the problem of evil, it's a very classic example of using philosophical ideas or philosophical theology to tease out possibilities, right? You take a couple of statements, God is all good, God is all powerful, and then you draw out the logical implications of that. And as the syllogism goes, those who don't buy into the idea of God say evil is incompatible with those two notions. If you have a God who's all good and a God who's all powerful, both of those things together, when you analyze those ideas, what cannot fall out is evil or suffering in the world. And it's here, and so God doesn't exist. And that's a way that philosophy operates. Take an idea, analyze it for its component parts, tease out the logical implications of those component parts. Analytical theology attempts to do that very same thing with classical doctrines of the church. So everything from atonement and soteriology to the nature of God, the impassibility of God, for example, can God suffer? Every single question, every doctrine of the church is then submitted to the canons of logic to tease out logical implications. A great example, and one of the places that analytic theology has done wonderful work, and Oliver Crisp himself has done incredible work, is in the incarnation and what it means to have one being with two natures in perichoretic union, the human and divine natures in the person of Jesus Christ. What does that mean exactly, and how can we tease it out, and what implications can we draw based on that notion? That's analytic theology. If this week, if doing these kinds of logical arguments really stokes you up, check out or try to take classes with Crisp. I mean, he's wonderful. I tend to be more of a constructive theologian. I will do analytic theology in pieces here and there, but in general, I tend to do constructive work. And what that means is I'm a little less rigorous, at least from the perspective of philosophical logic. But what I try to do is I try to incorporate a number of different sources and try to develop proposals, possibilities for what God is like, and what the church means, and what we ought to do in this situation. And it's always it's an attempt to explain how the world is. This is what we know the world is like because we see it. Here are a bunch of different sources, trustworthy sources we have about who God is and what God's like. Well, let's try to create a picture. It's always sort of ad hoc. It's always sort of proposal. Church, here's an idea. Do with it what you will. And if it's good, seize it. If it's not, push it away. But they're proposals. And another thing to do is take up a proposal. Well, if my dissertation's on the cross being God's labor, giving birth to spiritual children. Well, if that metaphor is valuable, if it really is the labor of God, what might that mean? And what implications might that have for everything, from our doctrine of the Trinity to our doctrine of the Incarnation to everything? It's a proposal. Here's an idea. It comes from a bunch of different sources. What might we be able to do with it? I'm a big tent theologian. I personally do more constructive type work, more integrative. I use a lot of scripture and a lot of readings of the Bible, readings from the tradition, things like that. But I also highly value the intellectual rigor and the precise thinking that's required when doing analytical theology. And I'm also indebted to the tradition, and I love the tradition, and so classical systematics is something that I like as well. I'm a Big Tent person. Not everyone is, and that's okay. My point is that if any of those three kind of draw you, then you should think about what that means for you in your future. Here, what kind of classes and teachers you want to have, and also how you're going to do your paper at the end of the quarter. Because I will accept any. I'm like I said, Big Tent. If you want to do analytic theology, I'll follow you and I'll think with you. If you want to do something a little more constructive, great. If you want to do more classic systematic, this is the Reformed tradition, places the doctrine of, whatever in here, and this is why. That's great. I'm all for it. But it's worth thinking about. It's worth recognizing that there's different ways of doing things, and it's worth thinking about what you have an affinity for, what you think is right, and why. Not everyone's a Big Tent like me, and that's okay. I think that there's valuable. I am not going to say that you shouldn't say it's got to be analytic and everything else is no good. That's fine if that's where you're convinced. Just know that you have the options and think through why you think one's better than the other. And yeah, that's my meta thought of the week on theology.